Hey everyone, before we start, I have to say, most of you watch my videos without subscribing. If you love scary stories, hit subscribe button and let's grow the creepy crew together. Don't forget to like the video and write the comment. I lived in a quiet neighborhood where everyone recognized each other by their car plates and weekend barbecues. It was the kind of place where nothing ever really happened, where kids rode their bikes until the streetlights came on, and where people left their doors unlocked without a second thought. I had a friend named Nate, the kind of guy who was always pulling pranks, some funny, some annoying, and a few that crossed the line. But that was just Nate. He had been like that since we were kids, always the one to push things a little too far. I met him years ago when we used to ride around on beat-up bikes, racing through the neighborhood like we owned it. As we got older, not much changed. He still showed up at parties with weird masks or ridiculous tricks up his sleeve. One time, he convinced a guy that his car had been stolen, only to reveal minutes later that he had just moved it down the street. Another time, he locked our friend Matt in a bathroom during a house party for nearly an hour. It was always something. I never thought much of it, just Nate being Nate. But sometimes, his jokes weren't really jokes. Sometimes, they were something else. One night, a few of us went out to eat at this small diner that served homemade meals. It was one of those spots that had been around forever, where the waitresses knew regulars by name and the menu hadn't changed in decades. We grabbed a booth near the back, the kind with old, cracked vinyl seats and a table that wobbled slightly if you leaned on it wrong. It was me, Nate, and a couple of our usual friends. I had a serious food allergy, one of those things that could land me in the hospital if I wasn't careful. Nate knew about it. Everyone did. I had mentioned it plenty of times, not in a dramatic way, just as something people should be aware of. Nate always brushed it off, made jokes about how I was too sensitive or how it was all in my head. It wasn't funny, but I had learned to ignore it. That night, he slid into the seat next to me, grinning like he always did when he was about to pull something. I wasn't paying attention at first, caught up in conversation with the others. Then, out of nowhere, he flicked something into my plate. I looked down. "Relax, man. It's just a joke," he said, laughing. At first, I didn't react. I thought maybe he was messing with me, that it wasn't really what I thought it was. But then I felt it. A sudden tightness in my throat, like someone had closed their hand around my windpipe. My chest constricted, my vision blurred for a second. My body knew before my brain did. I dropped my fork, my hands gripping the edge of the table. The conversation around me stopped. Someone said my name, but it sounded distant, like they were speaking through water. I gasped, trying to pull in air, but it wasn't working. My throat was swelling, my lungs refusing to cooperate. My heart slammed against my ribs, my hands were shaking. Across from me, our friend Jake was already standing up, knocking over his drink in the process. "Dude, he's not okay," he said, his voice sharp. Nate was still smiling, like he thought this was part of the joke. "Come on, man," he said, rolling his eyes. "It's not that serious." But it was. Jake didn't waste time. He grabbed my arm and pulled me up, practically dragging me out of the booth. I could barely stand. My legs felt like they weren't part of me. Someone, maybe Matt, was yelling for help, but everything around me was starting to blur. My throat was closing fast, and I couldn't get enough air. "Get him to the car!" someone shouted. Jake threw my arm over his shoulder and half carried me out of the diner. I could hear chairs scraping against the floor, people turning to look. Someone held the door open, and then we were outside. The cold air hit me like a punch, but it didn't help. My vision tunneled. My chest was heaving, but no air was getting through. "Where's his EpiPen?" someone asked. I fumbled weakly at my pocket, but my fingers were numb. I carried one, always, but in the chaos, I couldn't get to it. Then I heard Nate's voice behind me, still laughing. "Dude, this is so dramatic," he said. "It was just a tiny bit. You're fine." I wanted to turn around, to say something, but I couldn't. I was barely conscious when Jake shoved me into the back seat of his car. "Drive!" someone yelled. The next few minutes were a blur of headlights and speeding through red lights. I was slumped against the seat, my head pressed against the window. My vision flickered in and out. The pressure in my chest was unbearable, like a weight was crushing me from the inside. I felt the car jerk to a stop. Someone yanked the door open. Hands grabbed me, pulling me out. The next thing I remember was the bright, sterile lights of the hospital and the sound of voices shouting. My body felt like it was shutting down. Then, a sharp pain in my leg. The EpiPen. Air. It took a few more minutes, but slowly my throat started to open. My lungs sucked in air greedily. It still hurt, but I could breathe again. I was wheeled into a hospital room, my body weak and shaking. I don't know how long I was there before I heard a nurse muttering about how close it had been. "If he got here any later..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. I stayed in the hospital for hours while they monitored me. My friends were outside, waiting. All of them except Nate. He hadn't come. When I was finally able to sit up, Jake came in first. He looked pissed. "That was messed up," he said, shaking his head. He knew, and he still did it. I didn't say anything. I just sat there, trying to process it. I had known Nate for years. We had been through so much together. But this wasn't a joke. This wasn't funny. This was something else. Nate texted me later while I was still in the hospital. "Dude, chill. It wasn't that serious. You're fine." That was all he said. No apology, no concern. Just that. I stared at my phone for a long time. Then I turned it off. When I got home, things didn't feel the same. I kept replaying it in my head. The way he laughed while I was choking. The way he brushed it off like it was nothing. My friends were pissed. Even the ones who usually laughed at his pranks weren't defending him this time. But Nate? He still acted like it was no big deal. I saw him a few days later at another friend's house. He acted like nothing had happened, cracking jokes, trying to be the center of attention like always. I ignored him. Eventually, he came up to me. "Dude, are you really mad about that?" he asked, rolling his eyes. "Come on, you're alive, aren't you?" I just looked at him. That was the moment I realized I didn't know Nate at all. After that night, I stopped hanging out with him. So did a lot of the others. He didn't take it well. He kept calling, texting, saying we were all overreacting. But it wasn't an overreaction. It was the bare minimum. A few months later, he moved away. No one really kept in touch. I heard he tried to pull some other prank in another city and got into serious trouble. I don't think about him much anymore, but sometimes I'll see an old photo of us, back when we were just kids riding bikes. And it hits me how easily a person can cross the line. How someone you trust can turn into someone dangerous without you even realizing it. Now, I don't give people like Nate second chances. I was never the social type, so when Alex asked me out, I saw it as a good opportunity. We met in the parking lot of a local supermarket, the kind of place where old pickup trucks were always parked near the entrance. He seemed quiet, but considerate, always offering to help carry my bags to the car. There was nothing particularly strange about him, except maybe how often he asked about my family. It wasn't creepy, just a little persistent, like he wanted to know if I lived alone or had close relatives nearby. But I didn't think much of it. Everything around me was going as usual, and I was sure our relationship was developing normally. At first, things were simple. We'd meet up for coffee, take evening walks, watch movies at his place or mine. He never made a big scene, never lost his temper. If anything, he was almost too patient, too polite, always watching me closely when I spoke. He asked a lot of questions, especially about my routine. When I worked, when I got home, whether I ever went on trips. I figured he was just interested, maybe a little overly curious, but nothing alarming. As weeks went by, he started calling more often, sometimes just to check where I was. If I was out with friends, he'd ask how long I'd be, what we were doing, if any guys were there. It wasn't aggressive, just persistent, like he needed to keep track of me. I brushed it off as normal boyfriend stuff. He never yelled or got angry. He just had a way of making me feel like answering his questions was expected. Then he started inviting me over to his place more and more. It wasn't weird at first. He cooked for me, put on my favorite shows, made it comfortable. But after a while, I noticed he'd get irritated when I said I wanted to go home. He never argued, but there was this subtle shift in his expression, like he was disappointed in me for leaving. One night, we were watching a movie at his place when I realized I'd never seen most of the rooms in his house. It was small, but there was one door he never opened. A closet, maybe a storage space. When I asked about it, he was casual, almost too casual. Just old boxes, junk I haven't gone through, he said, locking it behind him as he walked past. The lock was new, shinier than the rest of the door handle. I didn't press him on it, but something about it stuck with me. It wasn't just that he kept it locked. It was how quickly he changed the subject, how his tone got just a little too smooth, too rehearsed, like he had an answer ready. I didn't want to overthink it. After all, everyone has private things. Maybe he was embarrassed about some hoarding habit or something. But after that night, I started noticing little things. His questions became more specific. If I mentioned stopping at the store, he'd ask which one. If I got home late, he'd ask why, even if I'd already told him earlier. I told myself it was just his way of showing he cared. I wanted to believe that. But deep down, something about it felt off. One evening, I was at his place again, and he got a phone call. He stepped into the other room to take it, lowering his voice. I couldn't make out the words, but his tone was sharp, like he was giving instructions to someone. When he came back, his whole demeanor changed. He was suddenly affectionate, overly sweet, asking if I wanted to stay the night. I made an excuse about work in the morning and grabbed my bag. As I headed for the door, I glanced toward that locked room again. He noticed. "You're really curious about that closet, huh?" he said, smiling. But there was something else behind it. I laughed it off. "Just seems weird to keep a junk closet locked." He shrugged, leaning against the door frame, watching me too closely. "Some things are better locked away." I nodded, forced a small smile, and walked out. That night, I couldn't sleep. Something about the way he said it, the way he looked at me. It wasn't normal. But I still couldn't explain why I felt so uneasy. It wasn't like he'd actually done anything. At least, not yet. As I was about to leave one evening, Alex suddenly locked the door behind me. The sound of the deadbolt sliding into place sent a chill through me. I turned around slowly, forcing a smile. "What's up?" I asked, keeping my voice light. He held something in his hand, a folder, thick with papers and photographs. His fingers tapped against the cover as he watched my face carefully. "I want to show you something," he said. His tone was calm, but there was an edge to it. He walked to the table and laid the folder down. Then, without a word, he opened it. The first thing I saw was a picture of me. Not just any picture, but one I didn't remember anyone taking. It was of me walking out of my apartment, carrying groceries, looking down at my phone. The next one was from a different day. Me at work, talking to a coworker. Page after page, photo after photo. Some from far away, some close up. Dates were scribbled in the corners. Notes. Observations. My breath caught in my throat. I flipped through the stack with shaking fingers. It wasn't just me. Other girls were in there too. Different faces, different locations. Some of them had names written beside them. Others just had question marks. Then I saw the objects. Small things taped onto the pages. A bus ticket. A hair tie. A keychain I had lost weeks ago. I looked up at him. He was smiling. "I like collecting memories," he said. "It helps me feel close to people." I swallowed, trying to stay calm. "Alex, this is a little intense." His smile faded. "You don't like it?" My mind was racing. I needed to get out of there. Now. I just need some air," I stammered, stepping back toward the door. His hand shot out, grabbing my wrist. Not hard, but firm enough to stop me. "I don't want you to leave yet," he said. "You haven't seen everything." I yanked my hand away, heart pounding. "I think I've seen enough." For a second, he just stood there. Then, without warning, he lunged for the folder, scooping it up and shoving it under his arm. His whole body tensed like he was preparing for something. I didn't wait to find out what. I turned and bolted toward the hallway leading to the kitchen. There was a back door there. I'd seen it before. I ran, hearing his footsteps right behind me. "Stop," he snapped, his voice no longer calm. I reached the door, yanking at the handle. Locked. I spun around just as he grabbed my arm again. This time, his grip was bruising. "Alex, let me go." "You don't understand," he hissed. "You weren't supposed to see that yet." Yet. That word sent a wave of cold through me. I lashed out, shoving him as hard as I could. It caught him off guard, just enough for me to twist free. There was a chair by the counter. I grabbed it and threw it at him. It wasn't much, but it made him stumble back, cursing. I didn't hesitate. I ran for the front door, unlocked it with shaking hands, and sprinted outside. I didn't stop until I was in my car, slamming the locks down and fumbling for my keys. Alex burst out onto the porch, his face unreadable in the dim light. He didn't chase me. He just stood there, watching as I sped away. I didn't go home that night. Instead, I drove to my friend's place, my hands still trembling on the wheel. The next morning, I called a friend of mine who worked in law enforcement. I told her everything. She listened in silence, then asked me one question that made my stomach drop. "Did you get the names of the other girls in that folder?" I hadn't. She told me she'd look into him. I didn't expect much. After all, he hadn't technically done anything illegal. Stalking, maybe. But I knew, deep down, that it was more than that. A few days later, she called me back. "You need to listen carefully," she said. "We ran his name. He was arrested years ago in another state, suspected of kidnapping. The girl was never found." I couldn't breathe. They didn't have enough evidence to convict him. He changed his name, moved, started over. My head was spinning. I had been alone with him, trusted him. I filed a report, but I knew it wouldn't do much. He was careful. He hadn't actually hurt me. Not yet. Then, a few months later, I saw his face on the news. Another woman had gone missing. They found her car abandoned near his house. When the police searched his place, they found that same locked room. Only this time, it wasn't empty. They found boxes filled with more memories, more photos, more names. Some of the girls in the pictures were never found. Alex was arrested again. This time, they had enough. I moved, changed my number, cut ties with anyone who might connect me to him. But I still can't shake the feeling that I got lucky. That if I had stayed just a little longer that night, I wouldn't have made it out. Even now, when I see a truck that looks like his, I feel my stomach drop. I don't date anymore. I don't trust as easily. And I never, ever ignore red flags again. We had been close friends since school, always driving around at night, loving fast cars and loud music. Trevor was the kind of guy who thrived on risk, obsessed with modified cars and constantly bragging about his driving skills. He had a way of making every trip feel like a race, pushing limits just to prove he could. It never seemed serious, just part of who he was. That night, we met up at the usual spot, a parking lot near an old diner that hadn't seen customers in years. It was where we always gathered before heading out, standing around cars, arguing about where to go next. Trevor was leaning against his hood, smoking, already hyped. His car, some heavily tuned coupe with a deafening exhaust, was his pride. He revved the engine a couple of times just to hear it growl. "Tonight," he said, "we go up the mountain roads. Twists, turns, steep climbs, real driver stuff." The others nodded, excited. I hesitated. I had been in his passenger seat too many times to know how reckless he could be. He liked to take blind corners at full speed, trusting his reflexes more than common sense. He called it driving with instincts. I called it stupid. Still, I didn't argue. We had done crazy stuff before. Nothing bad had ever happened. We piled into our cars, engines roaring to life, headlights cutting through the dark. The mountain roads weren't far, just outside town, where the asphalt turned to narrow, winding paths with no barriers between the edge and the drop below. It was the kind of place where a single mistake could mean a long fall into nothing. Trevor was leading, as always, speeding ahead like he owned the road. We followed, tires screeching around bends, the adrenaline kicking in. It felt like every other night, dangerous, sure, but controlled. At least, that's what I told myself. Somewhere near the top, we pulled over at a clearing. The view stretched for miles, city lights far below, silent and distant. The air was thin, cold. Trevor was grinning like a maniac, pacing back and forth, already thinking of something crazier. "That curve back there," he said, pointing down the road. "The one with the drop-off. Let's see who can take it the fastest." No one answered right away. Even the most reckless among us knew that turn. It was sharp, with no room for error. One of the guys laughed nervously. "You're kidding, right?" Trevor shook his head. "Come on, if you're scared, just admit it." The others exchanged glances. It was the kind of challenge that no one wanted to back down from, but no one really wanted to do either. I stepped forward. "This is stupid," I said. "You mess up, you don't walk away from it." Trevor smirked. "So don't mess up." The others were still on the fence, but Trevor had already decided. He got back in his car, revving the engine impatiently. "Last chance," he said. "Either you're in, or you're out." I shook my head. "I'm out." He laughed, shaking his head like I was pathetic. "Figures." The others hesitated, but eventually, a couple of them got into their cars, engines roaring back to life. I watched as they lined up, headlights cutting through the night. The idea of them tearing through that curve made my stomach knot, but I said nothing. I knew how this worked. If I spoke up again, I'd just be the guy who always worried too much. Trevor gave me one last look, grinning like he had already won. Then, with a sudden screech of tires, they were gone, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there for a moment, the distant hum of engines fading. Something felt wrong, heavier than usual. It wasn't just the risk. It was the way Trevor had pushed harder this time, like he had something to prove. I pulled out my phone, thinking about calling, just to tell them to take it easy. But I hesitated. They'd laugh. They'd call me paranoid. So I put my phone back in my pocket and just stood there, staring down the empty road. The next morning, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. At first I ignored it, half asleep, thinking it was just the group chat talking about last night. But then I saw the caller ID, one of our friends who hadn't gone with them. Something in my chest tightened. I picked up. "Did you hear?" His voice was tense, almost shaking. "There was an accident." Everything in me went cold. I sat up so fast my head spun. "What do you mean?" "They didn't come back. Trevor's car went off the cliff." I didn't say anything. My mouth was dry. My hands were clammy. I forced myself to ask, "Who?" But I already knew the answer. All of them. No one made it. I don't remember the next few minutes. I don't remember ending the call. I just remember staring at my phone, at the last messages from them. The last time I saw them, heard them. It didn't feel real. But it was. By the time I got to the crash site, the police were already there. The area was taped off, but I could still see the damage. Tire marks burned into the asphalt, leading straight to the edge. A few feet away, a section of the guardrail was completely missing, torn apart like it had been nothing. Beyond that, just empty air. A drop so deep, I couldn't even see the wreckage below. I felt sick. I imagined Trevor in that car, grinning, pushing the gas harder, faster, believing he could handle it, believing he was untouchable. And then, the moment he realized he wasn't. The police asked me questions. I answered in a daze. What were they doing last night? How fast was Trevor driving? Did he ever pull stunts like this before? I told them everything. That he always pushed too hard. That I had warned him. That I had stayed behind because I knew something like this could happen. It didn't make me feel any better. Their parents were there too. I couldn't look them in the eyes. What was I supposed to say? That their sons had died for a stupid challenge? That I could have stopped them, but I didn't? I just stood there, listening to their grief, their disbelief, their anger. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Trevor laughing, daring me to race. I heard the engines roaring, tires screeching, and then silence. A few days later, someone sent me a video. Footage from inside Trevor's car, taken from his dashboard camera. I hesitated before opening it, but in the end, I did. It was the last moments. Trevor was grinning, hyped up, music blasting. The others were laughing, shouting, hyping each other up. The road was dark, but his headlights lit the curve ahead. Then the turn came. Trevor didn't slow down. He pushed harder, gripping the wheel tight. The car tilted slightly, tires barely holding traction. For a second, it almost looked like he had it under control. Then, one wrong movement. The back end slid out. The laughter turned into shouting. The camera shook violently. And then, black. That was the last time I saw any of them. I don't drive like that anymore. I don't even like going near those roads. When I do, all I can think about is that night. The sound of their engines fading into the darkness. The last words I almost said. The call I never made. I keep telling myself it wouldn't have mattered. That Trevor wouldn't have listened. That they would have gone anyway. But I still wonder. What if I had tried harder? What if I had made them stay? Maybe they'd still be here. Haley and I met while working on a group project in one of our college courses. We clicked fast, bonding over shared frustrations about deadlines and professors who took forever to grade assignments. Our favorite spot was a small coffee shop just off campus, where we'd spend hours chatting about everything: classes, family drama, random thoughts about the future. She was the kind of person who always seemed reliable, the one you'd trust to have your back if you ever needed help. At first, when she started acting differently, I didn't think much of it. Everyone has rough patches. She became more withdrawn, more distracted. She still laughed at my jokes, still texted me back, but there was something off. If I asked her what was wrong, she'd just shrug or change the subject. I figured it was personal, maybe family trouble or something with a guy. I didn't push. If she wanted to talk, she would. That's how friendship worked, right? But over time, it got harder to ignore. She avoided eye contact. Her phone was always in her hand, fingers twitching over the screen like she was waiting for something. If it buzzed, she'd react too fast, sometimes putting it face down before I could see anything. I started getting this weird feeling, a sort of unease I couldn't explain. One evening, after class, we walked to the parking lot together. It was cold, one of those nights where the air bites at your skin. Haley wasn't wearing a thick enough jacket, and I noticed her shivering. I offered her a ride home. She hesitated for a second, then nodded. The drive was mostly quiet. She kept checking her phone, and I kept my eyes on the road, wondering if I should say something. Maybe she was in trouble. Maybe she needed help, but didn't know how to ask. When we got to her place, she muttered a quick, "Thanks," and got out. That's when I noticed it. Her phone, lying on the passenger seat. I picked it up automatically, my first thought being to call out to her. But she was already walking up the steps to her apartment, head down, not looking back. Then the screen lit up. A new message. It wasn't my business. I knew that. But the preview caught my attention before I could look away. The words weren't casual. Not the usual, "See you later," or "Where are you?" Plan in place. Just confirm when ready. My stomach twisted. My fingers hovered over the screen. The logical thing was to close it, to pretend I never saw it. But something in my gut told me to look. I swiped to open the messages. The conversation wasn't long, but it was enough. Enough to make my hands shake as I scrolled. It wasn't random. It wasn't vague. It was a plan. A detailed, calculated discussion about staging an accident. An accident meant for me. My hands went cold. I reread the messages, hoping I misunderstood, but the words were clear. They mentioned timing, location, even possible ways to make it look like a mistake. There was a reason Haley had been so distant. She wasn't just hiding something. She was planning something. And I was the target. I locked the phone and set it down, forcing myself to breathe. I needed to act normal. I couldn't let her know I had seen anything. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. Why? What had I done? There was a mention of jealousy, but nothing specific. I had never fought with her, never done anything to hurt her. At least, not that I knew of. I heard the sound of her apartment door shutting. She was inside now, unaware that I was sitting in my car, holding the evidence of whatever she was planning. For a moment, I considered just driving off, pretending I never saw it. But that wasn't an option. I couldn't unsee what I saw. And I definitely couldn't ignore it. I took one last breath, then grabbed her phone, got out of the car, and walked up to her door. I knocked, steadying my expression. A few seconds passed before she answered. She looked surprised to see me. Did I forget something? I held up her phone. You left this in my car. Her eyes flickered, just for a second, but I caught it. That moment of hesitation before she smiled and reached for it. "Oh, thanks. I didn't even notice." I let her take it. I didn't say anything about the messages. I couldn't. Not yet. She stood there for a moment, like she was expecting me to say something else. When I didn't, she nodded. "See you tomorrow?" I forced a smile. "Yeah, see you." Then I turned and walked away, feeling her eyes on my back the entire time. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those messages. I kept trying to find a way to explain it, some reasonable excuse that would make sense. But there wasn't one. By morning, I had made up my mind. I needed help. I remembered a guy from one of my old classes who had become a cop. We weren't close, but we had mutual friends. I dug through my contacts and found his number. When I called, I kept my voice steady and told him I had something serious to talk about. He agreed to meet me at a diner across town. When I got there, he was already waiting. I didn't waste time with small talk. I just pulled out my phone and showed him the screenshots I had taken before returning Haley's phone. He scrolled through them, his face unreadable. When he finished, he looked up. "This is serious." "I know." My voice was quieter than I intended. "What do I do?" He leaned back, thinking. "First, you stay somewhere safe. If she's really planning something, she might try to move fast. Don't be alone. Second, I'll take this to my department. We can look into it. See if there's anything else on her record." The idea of Haley having a record hadn't even crossed my mind. "You think she's done something like this before?" "I don't know. But this level of planning? It's not spur of the moment. She's been thinking about this for a while." That thought sent a chill down my spine. I nodded. "Okay. I'll stay with my cousin for a bit. She lives a few hours away." "Good. And don't contact Haley. Don't give her a reason to suspect anything." I agreed. We talked a little longer, and he assured me he'd keep me updated. Then I packed a bag and left town. A few days later, I got a call. Haley had been arrested. They had gone through her messages, found more details, more conversations. There was enough to take action. I didn't ask what exactly they found. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. The news spread fast. Friends started reaching out, asking if it was true, if I was okay. No one could believe it. Haley was always the quiet, dependable one. The one who never seemed angry or aggressive. But I had seen it with my own eyes. For a while, I kept trying to make sense of it. I replayed every conversation, every moment, searching for a sign I had missed. But there was nothing obvious. If I hadn't seen that message by accident, I might have never known until it was too late. That thought haunted me the most. It's been a while now, and I still don't trust people the way I used to. I keep my guard up, even with friends. I don't assume I know someone just because they smile and laugh with me. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't looked at her phone that night. Would I have ended up in a tragic accident? Would anyone have ever figured out the truth? I don't know, and I don't want to. I tell this story because people assume danger is obvious, that you'll see it coming. But sometimes, it hides behind familiar faces, and by the time you notice, it might be too late. I was just a regular guy. I liked watching sports, playing board games with friends, and unwinding at the end of a long work week. In our neighborhood, it was common to meet up on Friday nights at a small family-owned bar. Nothing fancy, just a cozy place where everyone could order whatever they wanted. That night, we were celebrating the end of a stressful week. Work had been brutal, and we all felt like we deserved a break. The group was the usual crowd. Guys I had known for years, people I trusted. There was never a reason to be on edge with them. Mason was the loud one, always cracking jokes that were borderline offensive but somehow still funny. Eric was the responsible guy, always the first to call it a night. And then there was Mark. Mark was easygoing, the kind of person who always knew how to make things more fun. If someone was having a bad day, he'd buy them a drink or get them to laugh. That's why, when he handed me a drink that night, I didn't think twice about it. "Special mix," he said, grinning. "Just try it." It was a deep amber color, served in a short glass. I took a sip. The taste was strange, not necessarily bad, just different. There was a bitterness to it, something herbal, but also a strong, almost fruity undertone. I made a face, and Mark laughed. "Yeah, I know. Weird, right?" "It's a little experiment," he said. "I had the bartender mix some stuff together. You're my test subject." I took another sip. Still strange, but drinkable. The night went on as usual. We talked about work, argued about last week's game, and made fun of Mason for yet another failed attempt at dating. Someone ordered another round of wings, and Eric, like always, checked his watch and said he'd head out soon. It was a normal night. But after a while, something felt off. At first, I thought it was just the usual Friday night exhaustion. My vision started to blur slightly, like when you stand up too fast after sitting for too long. The room seemed dimmer, even though the lighting hadn't changed. Conversations around me felt distant, like I was hearing them through water. I rubbed my eyes. Maybe I was just tired. But then the dizziness hit. Not the kind you get from drinking too much. This was different, sharper. My head felt heavy, like I was struggling to keep it upright. The faces around me started to double, shifting slightly out of sync, like a bad TV signal. I blinked hard, trying to refocus, but it didn't help. Mark was saying something, laughing about a story Mason was telling, but his voice sounded muffled. I gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady myself. "You good?" Eric asked, frowning. "Yeah," I said automatically, but even my own voice sounded wrong, too slow, like I was hearing it on delay. Something was very, very wrong. I stood up, but the moment I did, the floor tilted beneath me. My stomach lurched, and I had to grab the back of my chair to keep from stumbling. The room was spinning now. The overhead lights looked too bright, then too dim, flickering like my vision couldn't keep up. Mark was still talking, still grinning, completely unaware that I was struggling to stay upright. I looked at my drink. I had barely finished half of it. The dizziness got worse. My fingers tingled like they weren't getting enough blood. I tried to take a step forward, but my legs felt disconnected from my body. "Hey, seriously, are you okay?" Eric's voice cut through the fog, sharper this time, more concerned. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come out right. My tongue felt heavy, my thoughts sluggish. Something was wrong with me. I needed to get out of there. I don't remember much after that. I remember stumbling toward the exit, feeling like I was walking through deep water. Eric's hand grabbed my arm, steadying me. His face was blurry, his voice distant. "We're getting you to a hospital," he said. The cold air outside hit me like a slap, but it didn't help. My body felt detached, like I was floating above myself. Someone guided me into a car. I think it was Mason. The ride was a blur of streetlights streaking past the windows. I wanted to say something, to ask what was happening to me, but my mouth wouldn't work. At the hospital, everything was noise and movement. Bright lights, voices asking questions I couldn't answer. My body felt sluggish, heavy. A nurse's face came into view, then disappeared. Someone was taking my blood pressure. The beeping of machines blurred into the pounding in my skull. Then darkness. When I woke up, everything was still wrong. My head felt like it was full of cement. The world around me was hazy. I blinked, but my vision wouldn't clear. It was like trying to see through a thick, dirty window. Shapes moved in front of me, voices murmured, but I couldn't focus. Eric was there when I finally managed to form words. What happened? You were drugged, he said, his face pale and tight. Doctors said something was in your system. They're still running tests. I tried to sit up, but my body wasn't cooperating. My hands felt weak. The worst part was my eyes. I couldn't see properly. Everything was smeared, shifting, like I was looking through broken glass. A doctor came in, serious expression, clipped tone. He explained the results. Some kind of chemical had affected my nervous system, particularly my vision. They didn't know if it was permanent. My stomach dropped. What do you mean you don't know? It depends on how your body recovers, the doctor said. We'll monitor your progress over the next few days. The next few days were hell. My vision didn't improve. Everything was distorted, blurry at best, dark at worst. The hospital room felt like a cage. Mark didn't visit. Mason came once, looking uncomfortable, saying Mark hadn't known the drink would do this. But I didn't believe that. Eric stayed the longest. We need to find out where he got that drink, he said. I didn't have the energy to care. My life was falling apart. I couldn't work like this. I couldn't drive. I could barely walk down a hallway without bumping into something. Mark finally called on the third day. His voice was shaking. Man, I didn't know. I swear. I didn't know it would do this. What was in it? I asked, forcing the words out. Silence. Then, I got it from some guys I know. They said it was a new mix, something different. I just wanted to mess around, see what it tasted like. My hands clenched into fists. You poisoned me. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I hung up. The investigation started soon after. The hospital had reported the case, and it turned out the substance in my system wasn't just alcohol or drugs. It was something experimental, unregulated. Mark had gotten it from some sketchy supplier without even asking what it was. The police questioned him. He claimed he didn't mean any harm, that he thought it was just a weird cocktail ingredient. But no one bought that. Not after what happened to me. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to see him locked up, to make him pay. But none of it would fix my vision. None of it would give me back the life I had before that night. Mark disappeared after that. No calls, no messages. It was like he couldn't face what he'd done. The others stopped talking to him too. Even Mason, who had always defended him, said he couldn't forgive this. The weeks that followed were brutal. Doctors, tests, therapies. The final verdict came after a month. My vision would never fully recover. I could see, but not well. Everything was blurry, warped. No surgery could fix it. I had to learn to navigate the world differently. I started using a cane. I had to quit my job. I had to rely on other people more than I ever wanted to. Some nights, I lay awake thinking about that moment. Mark handing me that drink, laughing like it was just another joke. If I had just said no. If I had noticed something was off. But I hadn't. And now, this was my life. I tell this story as a warning. You never know when a careless mistake, a stupid decision, can change everything. And sometimes, the people you trust the most are the ones who hurt you the worst. Danny and I had been friends since childhood. We used to race down dirt roads in his old truck, talk about our future, and dream about starting our own business. When he got locked up for a couple of years, I really hoped it would be a wake-up call for him. I wrote him letters, sent care packages with magazines about home repairs and gardening, thinking maybe he'd pick up something useful. The day he got out, he called me. I was genuinely happy to hear from him and invited him to our usual cafe to celebrate. When I saw him again, he looked a little thinner, but otherwise the same. He shook my hand firmly, smiling, but his eyes seemed to scan the room as if he was checking for something. We sat at our usual booth, ordered coffee, and talked like old times. He asked about my job, mutual friends, and if anything major had changed while he was away. At first, Danny was quiet, like he was adjusting to being back in the real world. He told me how strange it felt, how 2 years inside made everything out here seem faster. I could tell he was trying to find his place again. For the next few weeks, we hung out more often. He seemed different, not in an obvious way, but little things. He watched people closely, like he didn't trust them. He'd make comments about how anyone can betray you. He started talking about how prison taught him a lot, but not in the way I had hoped. One day, we drove out to a garage where he was fixing up his truck. It was an old, beat-up Ford that had been sitting for years. He had a plan to get it running again and use it for work. I liked seeing him focused on something productive. As we stood there, drinking cheap gas station coffee, he casually mentioned that someone owed him money. Said it in a flat tone, like he was just stating a fact. I didn't think much of it until he added, "I need to deal with it." I assumed he meant asking for his money back, maybe pushing a little harder than he should. But something about the way he said it felt off. A couple of days later, he picked me up in that same truck. The repairs weren't finished, but it ran. He wanted to take a drive, said he had something to show me. We pulled up to a quiet spot off the highway, near a storage unit he was renting. He got out, walked around to the back, and lifted the tailgate. Inside, neatly arranged, were a roll of duct tape, a length of thick rope, and a shovel. I stared at the contents of Danny's truck bed, my mind racing to come up with an explanation that wasn't what it looked like. Maybe he was working on a project, maybe it was for something harmless, but deep down, I knew better. Danny must have seen the look on my face because he smirked. "Relax," he said, slamming the tailgate shut. "I just need to handle some unfinished business." I felt my stomach tighten. What the hell does that mean? He leaned against the truck, arms crossed. "That guy I told you about? The one who owes me? He thinks he can get away with it." His tone was calm, almost casual. But I learned a few things inside. How to handle situations without leaving loose ends. I took a step back. "Danny, this isn't how you fix things." His expression changed, his smirk fading. "You don't get it. Out here, people like him think they can walk all over you. I'm not letting that happen again." I shook my head. "I'm not part of this." His jaw tightened. "I thought you had my back." "This isn't having your back. This is something else." Danny exhaled sharply, then turned away. "Fine," he muttered. "Forget it." He climbed into the truck, and I didn't try to stop him as he pulled away. I stood there for a while, heart pounding. I knew I should do something. Call someone. But I had no proof, just a gut feeling that something bad was about to happen. The next day, I tried calling him, but he didn't pick up. His social media accounts were gone. None of our friends had heard from him. It was like he'd disappeared overnight. Weeks passed. I kept telling myself maybe I was overreacting, that maybe he'd just taken off somewhere to cool down. But then the rumors started. Someone had gone missing. A guy who owed money to the wrong people. No one knew for sure what happened, but there were whispers, about a late-night meeting, about a man last seen getting into an old Ford truck. And then, the news broke. Danny had been arrested. The police had found something. I never got the full details, but it was bad. Evidence tied him to the missing man. There were stories about a shallow grave, about a botched attempt to cover something up. I never reached out to him after that. I didn't want to know more. Sometimes I think back to when we were kids, tearing down dirt roads, talking about the future. Back when he wasn't like this. I still wonder where it all went wrong. Dylan and I had lived in the same neighborhood since the days when everyone was riding skateboards and dreaming of becoming social media famous. He was the kind of guy who laughed loudly and talked about big plans but never actually followed through on anything. We used to go together to a hot dog stand near the park and talk about how cool it would be to move to a big city one day. Parties were rare in our area, so when some old friends from the neighboring state came to visit, it was a big deal. Dylan convinced me to go, saying it would be fun. When we got there, the house was already packed. People were moving from room to room, drinking, eating pizza, and shouting over the music. The air was thick with the smell of beer and sweat. Someone had knocked over a cup, and a sticky puddle spread across the floor near the couch. The lights were dim, flickering a little because of a faulty socket. At first, I was just hanging out, talking to a couple of guys I hadn't seen in a while. But after a while, I noticed Dylan was acting a little off. Normally, he was in the center of things, cracking jokes or telling stories. Tonight, though, he barely talked to anyone. He kept looking around like he was expecting something. His eyes kept darting toward the table near the entrance, where people had left their bags and jackets. I figured he was just in a weird mood. Maybe he had a bad day or something. I didn't ask. He wasn't drinking much, which was also unusual, but again, I didn't think much of it. As the night went on, people started to get louder, messier. Some guy spilled chips all over the carpet. A couple was arguing near the kitchen, their voices barely audible over the bass-heavy music. Dylan stuck close to me, not saying much. Every now and then, he'd glance at the bags again. Around midnight, he suddenly leaned in and said he had to take care of something at home. "Hey, can I use your phone real quick? Need to call my mom," he said. I didn't think twice about it. We'd known each other forever. I handed him my phone without hesitation. The next morning, I woke up to loud knocking on my door. My head was pounding from lack of sleep, and for a second, I thought it was just part of a dream. But then I heard voices, firm, serious. I got up, still half asleep, and opened the door. 2 cops stood there. One of them, a tall guy with a shaved head, asked, "You were at a party last night?" I nodded, suddenly more awake. "Yeah. Why?" The other officer, a woman with sharp eyes, glanced at her notepad. "We got a report about stolen property, phones, wallets, cash. Several guests say you left early and were acting suspicious." I blinked at her, confused. "That's not true. I stayed almost until the end, and I didn't take anything." The first cop studied me for a second. "Mind if we come in?" I stepped back, letting them in, still trying to wrap my head around what was happening. "Wait, hold on. You think I stole something?" "We have reports that your phone was used to make a purchase with a stolen credit card," the woman said, flipping through her notes. "That puts you in the middle of this." My stomach dropped. "Dylan. I let my friend use my phone last night," I said quickly. Dylan Carter. Maybe he..." "Do you have proof of that?" she interrupted. I hesitated. Of course I didn't. Dylan had just borrowed my phone for a call. I didn't think to check if he did anything else. The cops exchanged looks. The man sighed. "You might want to get a lawyer." I sat down, feeling like the walls were closing in. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be. I tried calling Dylan. No answer. I texted him. Nothing. It was like he had vanished. The next few days were a blur of stress, questions, and disbelief. The cops kept coming back, asking the same things in different ways. Some of my friends backed me up, saying they saw me the whole night, but others weren't sure. And without hard proof, I looked guilty. Meanwhile, Dylan was just gone. His house was empty, his car missing, his room cleaned out. No one knew where he went. Some people said they heard he left town. Others thought he might have gone to stay with distant relatives. I started to hear rumors that Dylan had done this before, that he had a habit of stealing, lying, disappearing when things got bad. I had never noticed. Or maybe I just didn't want to. The cops weren't able to charge me with anything concrete, but the damage was done. People looked at me differently. Some stopped inviting me places. Even my parents weren't sure what to believe. Weeks passed, then months. The case faded, but my name was still tied to it. Every now and then, I checked online, wondering if Dylan would ever surface, but he never did. Jake's house was our usual spot for hanging out. It was big, with a basement full of old junk and tools, and he always found ways to keep things interesting. Whether it was board games, watching sports, or random challenges, he liked bringing everyone together. Most of the time, we just went along with it. One night, after a few drinks, he said something weird. He told us our group wasn't strong enough, and that we needed something to solidify our bond, some kind of loyalty oath. Nobody took it seriously. We thought it was another one of his dumb ideas, like the time he made us do a trust fall off his garage roof into a pile of mattresses. Just something for laughs. He kept talking, though, saying that real friends should have a deeper connection, something more symbolic. A few guys played along, throwing out jokes, but I noticed how Jake was watching us, like he was waiting to see who would agree. Eventually, he said he had an idea. It would be simple, just a small gesture to prove we were all part of something bigger. Nothing crazy, he promised, grinning like he was about to pull off the best prank of his life. None of us questioned him, not really. He had a way of making things sound like fun, even when they weren't. He disappeared into the basement and came back a few minutes later with an old glass jar and a small pocket knife. "All right," he said, setting them down on the table. "We each give a drop of blood. Just a tiny cut, a little mix, and boom, we're officially bonded for life." At first, we laughed. It sounded ridiculous, like something out of a bad movie. But Jake was serious. He held up the knife and looked at us expectantly. One of the guys, Mark, shrugged. "Screw it. Why not?" He took the knife, poked the tip of his finger, and let a drop of blood fall into the jar. No hesitation. Then Chris did the same, and then Tyler. The whole time, Jake just watched, nodding slightly, like he was pleased. When the knife was handed to me, I hesitated. Something about this felt off. The whole thing was just weird. Not like our usual dumb bets or drinking games. There was something too deliberate about it, like Jake had been planning this for a while. "Nah, I'm good," I said, pushing it away. Jake raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. "All right, your choice." I needed air. I stepped outside, inhaling the cool night breeze, trying to shake the uneasy feeling in my gut. It was just a stupid game, right? Nothing serious. Still, something about the way Jake looked at that jar, the way he almost seemed excited. It stuck with me. When I went back inside, they were already sitting around the table again, drinking, laughing, like nothing had happened. The jar was gone. The next day, things started feeling off. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just little things. Mark mentioned he had trouble sleeping, said he kept waking up in the middle of the night feeling like someone was standing over him. Tyler joked that maybe it was the blood pact coming back to haunt them. We all laughed, but there was a weird tension in the air. Then Chris said something that made me stop. "I swear, I had this dream last night," he said, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. "I was in Jake's basement, but it was different. Like, darker. And there was this..." He shook his head. "Never mind. It was just a dream." Jake, who had been quiet until then, leaned forward slightly. "What did you see?" Chris hesitated. "I don't know. Just jars. A bunch of them, all lined up." He let out a nervous chuckle. "Guess my brain's just messing with me." Jake didn't laugh. He just smiled, that same small, knowing smile he always had when he was keeping something to himself. Over the next few days, things got stranger. Mark kept saying he felt like he was being watched. Tyler admitted he was starting to feel uneasy in his own house. Chris stopped talking about his dreams altogether, but I could tell something was bothering him. And Jake? He seemed fine. More than fine, actually. He looked energized, like he was enjoying this, even though he never outright said anything. Then, one night, Mark didn't show up for work. At first, we thought maybe he was just sick or forgot to call in, but then he didn't answer his phone. His girlfriend said she hadn't seen him since the night before. We tried to stay calm. Maybe he just needed space. Maybe he went off the grid for a while. It wasn't like we hadn't done dumb things before. But as the hours passed, the unease grew. Jake, as usual, acted like it was nothing. "Mark's probably fine," he said with a shrug. "Maybe he just took off for a bit. You know how he is." But something about the way he said it, so casual, so dismissive, made my stomach turn. That night, I drove to Jake's house. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, but I needed to talk to him alone. Needed to understand why he was acting like this. Jake let me in without hesitation, like he'd been expecting me. "What's up?" he asked, leaning against the doorway. "You don't think this is weird?" I asked. "Mark disappearing right after that whole thing?" Jake smirked. "Coincidence." But I didn't believe that, and I didn't trust him. While he grabbed drinks from the kitchen, I made my way toward the basement. Something in my gut told me I needed to see it for myself. I crept down the stairs, my heart pounding. The basement was cluttered, same as always. But then I noticed something new. Shelves along the back wall. And on them, lined up neatly in rows, were glass jars. My mouth went dry. They weren't empty. Some had locks of hair. Others had fingernail clippings. Some had what looked like dried bloodstains on scraps of cloth. And then I saw it. A jar with Mark's name on it. Footsteps creaked behind me. I turned to see Jake standing at the top of the stairs watching me. "You weren't supposed to see that," he said. I didn't think. I just ran. Pushed past him, bolted for the door. I heard him laughing behind me, but I didn't stop. I jumped into my car and sped off, my hands shaking. I called Chris and Tyler that night, told them what I saw. Neither of them wanted to believe me. But the next morning, Jake was gone. No social media updates. No calls. His house was empty. It was like he had vanished. And Mark? He was never found. To this day, I don't know what really happened that night. I don't know if the ritual meant anything, or if Jake had been planning something long before that. All I know is that he changed after that night. Or maybe he had always been that way, and we just never saw it. But sometimes, late at night, I get this feeling. Like someone is watching me. Like Jake is still out there, waiting. And I wonder if one day, he'll come back to collect what he thinks he's owed. When I moved to a new neighborhood, I was looking for a quiet place with neat houses, somewhere I could relax after work. My neighbor, Jason, introduced himself right away and even offered to help with my move. He pulled a few tools out of his pickup truck and helped me put together some of my furniture. I took it as a friendly gesture. He seemed like a nice guy, easy to talk to. Over the next few weeks, we got into the habit of grabbing coffee on weekends, chatting about movies and the latest game from the local team. It was nice to have someone to talk to, especially since I didn't know anyone else in the area. He was always friendly, never pushed boundaries, and never made me feel uncomfortable. If anything, he was one of the more normal people I had met in a long time. I had no reason to think anything was off. He was just a helpful neighbor. One evening, I was looking for my wallet at home when I accidentally knocked my phone charger behind the nightstand near the window. I moved the nightstand to grab it, but as I did, I noticed something odd. A small, barely noticeable camera was tucked among the cables. For a second, I just stared at it, thinking maybe I was imagining things. But when I picked it up, I realized it was real. It wasn't just some toy or leftover junk from the previous tenant. It was a functioning device, pointed right at my bed. My first reaction was denial. Maybe it wasn't what it looked like. But I checked it closely, and there was no mistake. Someone had placed a hidden camera in my bedroom. My stomach twisted. I felt exposed in my own home. I tried to think of a logical explanation. Maybe the landlord had installed it? Maybe it was old, forgotten, and not even working? But as I examined it, my gut told me otherwise. Someone had been watching me. The next morning, I went straight to the hardware store and bought a new lock. If someone had access to my apartment, I wasn't going to let them walk in again. But as I replaced the lock, an unsettling thought hit me. Whoever put that camera there must have already been coming and going as they pleased. They probably had a key. That night, I tore through my apartment, searching every inch of the place. I checked behind furniture, inside vents, and under shelves. I didn't expect to find anything else. Maybe I just wanted to reassure myself. But then, in the living room, hidden in the corner near my TV, I found another one. At that moment, my whole body tensed. One hidden camera was already bad enough, but two? That meant this wasn't some random accident or leftover device. Someone had deliberately planted them. Someone had been watching me, monitoring my every move. I sat down, staring at the tiny device in my hand, trying to think logically. Who could have done this? Who even had access to my apartment? Then it hit me. Jason. He was the only person who had ever had a key. A few months ago, I had given him a spare while I was out of town for a couple of days. He had offered to check in on my place, make sure nothing happened. At the time, I had thought nothing of it. Just another neighborly favor. My heart started pounding. I pulled out my phone and looked up his social media. I had never paid much attention to it before, but now I scrolled with a purpose. His posts were mostly harmless. Pictures of his truck, some random sports commentary, a couple of jokes. But then I found something that made my stomach turn. A vague, cryptic post from a few weeks ago. Sometimes you find the most interesting things right next door. Just have to know where to look. It had no comments, no context, nothing incriminating on its own. But combined with what I had just found, it felt like a confession. I needed proof. That night, I installed a motion sensor in my hallway. Just a small, discreet device that would alert me if someone entered while I was asleep. I locked my bedroom door and lay in bed, my mind racing. At 3:42 a.m., my phone buzzed. The sensor had detected movement. I froze. I hadn't heard anything. No creaking floors, no doors opening. But my phone didn't lie. Someone was inside my apartment. I reached for the baseball bat I kept under my bed. My heart pounded so hard I could barely hear over it. I crept to the bedroom door and pressed my ear against it, straining to hear anything. Silence. I waited. Minutes passed. Then, the softest sound. A door clicking shut. I didn't move until the sun came up. The next morning, I called the police. I told them about the cameras, the motion sensor alert, everything. They told me to gather as much evidence as I could before filing a report. That was when I had an idea. A friend of mine worked in IT security. I called him and asked if there was any way to track where the camera feeds were being sent. He came over that afternoon, and after some digging, he found an IP address. It belonged to Jason. That was all I needed. I went straight to the police station and filed a report. They took it seriously. The fact that he had access to my apartment and had been secretly recording me was enough for them to get a warrant. The police raided Jason's house the next day. What they found made my skin crawl. Dozens of files. Videos of me in my own home, sleeping, watching TV, eating, changing clothes. He had been watching me for months. When they arrested him, he didn't even deny it. He just said, "I was curious." Curious. That word made me sick. Jason was charged with multiple offenses: illegal surveillance, breaking and entering, stalking. The police assured me he wouldn't be getting out anytime soon. But it didn't matter. I couldn't stay in that apartment. Even after changing the locks, even after knowing he was gone, I never felt safe there again. Every shadow, every sound, every creak of the floor made my skin crawl. I moved out within a month. To this day, I don't trust my neighbors. I keep my doors locked at all times. I never lend anyone a spare key, and every few weeks I check my home for hidden cameras, just in case. I moved to the city for college and needed a cheap place to stay, so I started looking for rooms in student housing. That's how I met Jess. She seemed really nice at first. Friendly, easy to talk to, and super enthusiastic when she found out we had things in common. She told me she loved the same shows I did, suggested we order pizza together the first night, and even invited me to a local event the next weekend. It felt great to have a roommate who actually wanted to hang out. I'd heard horror stories about living with total strangers, but Jess made things easy. At first, I didn't think much about how quickly she attached herself to me. If I mentioned liking something, she suddenly loved it too. If I talked about an old hobby, she'd say she had always wanted to try it. It felt flattering in a way, to have someone so eager to be friends. I was new in town, she made things easier, and I liked having company. We settled into a routine. After classes, we'd hang out in our room, watch whatever was trending, and split takeout. She always wanted to be included in whatever I was doing, and at first, I appreciated it. If I was stressed about an assignment, she'd insist on helping, even when I didn't need it. If I was feeling down, she'd be the first to notice and try to cheer me up. She seemed like the perfect friend, always available, always interested. Looking back, there were little moments that should have stood out. When I mentioned making plans with classmates, she'd get quiet and distant. If I had to leave for something, she'd ask a lot of questions: where I was going, who I was meeting, when I'd be back. It never seemed like a big deal at the time, just curiosity. But little by little, things changed. Jess started making comments about how other people didn't get me the way she did. She'd say things like, "We understand each other better than anyone else," or, "I don't think those people really care about you." At first, I laughed it off. It sounded dramatic, but she said it in a way that seemed playful, like a joke between friends. But then she started getting frustrated whenever I made plans that didn't include her. If I invited classmates over, she'd sit in the corner, barely talking, watching everyone like she was waiting for them to leave. Sometimes she'd make weird, offhanded comments, little jabs disguised as jokes. If someone mentioned a funny memory from their past, she'd say something like, "Wow, I guess I don't know you at all, huh?" If I laughed at something someone said, she'd go quiet, staring at her phone like she wasn't even listening. After a while, my classmates stopped coming by. Jess was never openly rude, but the atmosphere was tense whenever she was around. I didn't want to deal with awkwardness or hear her passive-aggressive remarks after they left. It was easier to avoid conflict. That's when she started getting even weirder. She would say things like, "You don't need anyone else," or "I don't like sharing you." Once, after I got back from a study session, she looked at me and said, "I feel like you're slipping away from me." She smiled after she said it, but something about the way she looked at me made my skin crawl. One night, while we were eating, she suddenly said, "You belong to me." She laughed right after, like it was a joke, but my stomach twisted. I forced a smile and said, "That's a weird thing to say." She shrugged. "I just mean, no one else understands you like I do. You don't need anyone else." I tried to laugh it off, but my appetite was gone. One evening, I had to stay late on campus for a group project. It wasn't a big deal, just a normal study session. But Jess started blowing up my phone. At first, it was just messages asking when I'd be back. Then she started calling. When I didn't answer right away, she sent a text that said, "You should have told me you'd be gone this long." That rubbed me the wrong way. She wasn't my parent, and I didn't owe her constant updates. I ignored it and stayed another hour. By the time I got back to our room, I was exhausted and just wanted to go to bed. But the moment I opened the door, my stomach dropped. Lying in the center of my bed was a dead rat. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. Its tiny body was stiff, its tail curled, its fur matted with something dark. Next to it was a piece of paper. My hands were shaking as I picked it up. 4 words were scrawled across it in uneven, almost frantic handwriting. "We always stay together." I dropped my bag. My breath came fast and shallow. Before I could even react, the bathroom door creaked open and Jess stepped out. She was drying her hands on a towel, acting like nothing was wrong. She saw me standing there, my face pale, the note still in my fingers. Her eyes flicked to the rat, then back to me. And then, with a small smile, she said, "How was your day?" I couldn't speak. I just stood there, my pulse hammering in my ears. I wanted to demand an explanation, to ask her what the hell was wrong with her, but I couldn't get the words out. Jess tilted her head. "You look upset." I forced myself to move. I stepped back toward the door, but she didn't react. She just stood there, waiting, watching, like she was enjoying this. I slept at a friend's place that night. I told them what happened, but saying it out loud made me feel crazy. Who does something like that? The next morning, I went straight to the dorm office to report it. They didn't take me seriously. The woman at the desk just sighed and said, "Roommate drama happens. Maybe try talking to her." She even had the nerve to suggest I might be overreacting. I realized then that no one was going to help me. That night, I started packing. I didn't care where I went. I just needed out. A friend from another dorm offered to let me crash on her floor until I could sort things out. I waited until Jess was in the shower before grabbing my suitcase. My hands were shaking so badly that I fumbled with the zipper. I had barely started when I felt something. A shift in the air. A presence. I turned my head and froze. Jess was sitting on the edge of my bed watching me. She wasn't saying anything. She wasn't even blinking. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, her posture stiff, like a doll someone had carefully placed there. Then, in the softest voice, she said, "You're leaving me." A chill ran down my spine. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but she cut me off. You don't have to. You don't have to leave. We're meant to be together. I couldn't do this. I grabbed my bag and bolted. Jess lunged toward me, but I was faster. I tore open the door and sprinted down the hall, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. By some miracle, the dorm's security guard was in the lobby. I ran straight to him, gasping, trying to explain. Jess hadn't followed me, but I felt her presence like a shadow clinging to my back. The guard must have seen the terror in my face because, for once, someone actually listened. He called the dorm supervisor. After that, things moved fast. I was transferred to a different building by the end of the week. Jess wasn't allowed near me. A few days later, campus security started looking into her. From what I heard, they found some disturbing things in her room. Personal items of mine she had stolen, weird diary entries about me, even more dead animals hidden in boxes. I don't know what happened to her after that. I didn't want to know. I just wanted to forget. But even now, I still think about that night. About the way she looked at me in the dark. About the note she left on my bed. And worst of all, about what might have happened if I hadn't woken up in time. I never had any interest in questionable substances. At parties, I stuck to juice or soda, while others experimented with whatever new thing was going around. In our town, there was a group always chasing some new way to relax or expand their minds. My friend Mark was part of that crowd. He always acted like he knew exactly what he was doing, even though he had no medical background. He talked like an expert, like he had everything under control. I kept my distance from their experiments, but Mark had a way of making things sound harmless, and I trusted him. There was a reason for that. A few months back, we were at a bar when some drunk guy wouldn't leave me alone. He kept leaning in too close, brushing against me, ignoring every clear signal to back off. Mark stepped in, calm but firm, and got between us. He didn't start a fight. He just made it clear that I wasn't alone, and the guy backed down. After that, I saw him differently. Not just as one of those reckless guys in town, but as someone I could rely on. Someone who would look out for me. One evening, Mark came over unannounced. He had that usual confident, easygoing smile, but there was something else. An excited energy, like he was eager to share a secret. He sat down, leaned forward, and pulled a small plastic case from his pocket. Inside was a thin syringe. Nothing heavy, he assured me. Just a mild thing. You won't feel out of control, just a nice wave of warmth, some euphoria. No harm, I swear. I hesitated. He must have seen it because he kept talking, his voice smooth, reassuring. He said he had tried it himself, that it was clean, that it wasn't like those dangerous street drugs. This is the safest thing you'll ever try, he said. Just a little lift. You deserve to feel good for once. I wasn't convinced, but he kept going, telling me how I was too cautious, how I never let myself experience anything new. One time, he said, just to see what it's like. He made it sound so reasonable, so small. I don't know what got to me. Curiosity, trust, or just the way he spoke like there was nothing to be afraid of. After a moment, I nodded. He prepped everything carefully, like he'd done this 100 times before. The needle was thin, barely noticeable. When he injected it, there was a slight sting, but nothing more. See, he said, grinning. Easy. At first, he was right. A lightness spread through me, like a soft wave. The room felt warmer, the lights a little brighter. My body relaxed in a way I'd never felt before, like I was floating just above my own skin. We sat there talking, and for a while, it felt nice. 2 hours passed. Then something changed. It started as a dull ache in my stomach. Nothing too alarming. But within minutes, it sharpened, twisting into something unbearable. A pain so intense it stole my breath. I doubled over, gripping my sides, trying to stay upright. Mark's voice came through, suddenly sharp with panic. "Hey, what's wrong?" I couldn't answer. A deep, cramping pressure spread through my chest, my arms, my legs. My muscles locked up, my fingers stiffened. It felt like my own body was turning against me, like I was being squeezed from the inside out. I tried to speak, to tell Mark something was wrong, but my words came out slurred, heavy. My tongue felt thick, uncooperative. My vision blurred at the edges, the room warping, tilting. I gasped, trying to pull in air, but it felt wrong, too shallow, too fast. Mark grabbed my shoulders. "Hey, stay with me. What's happening?" I tried to answer, but my jaw wouldn't move right. A wave of nausea hit me so hard I thought I might pass out. My limbs were going numb, my body losing all sense of coordination. I slid sideways, barely catching myself before hitting the floor. I saw the shift in Mark's expression. The confidence was gone. His face was pale, his hands shaking. He reached for his phone. "I need to get you to a hospital." That was the last thing I clearly remember. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed. My whole body felt wrong. Heavy, sluggish, like I was wrapped in wet cement. My mouth was dry, my throat raw. I tried to move my fingers, but they barely responded. My legs felt distant, like they weren't even attached to me. A nurse noticed I was awake and hurried off to get a doctor. Moments later, a man in a white coat appeared, checking the monitors beside me. "Can you hear me?" he asked. I tried to nod, but my neck barely moved. "You were brought in with severe neurological distress," he said. "Your friend said you had a bad reaction to an injection." "Mark." I tried to speak, but my words came out slow, garbled. The doctor must have seen the panic in my eyes. "Take it easy," he said. "You've suffered some serious nerve damage. We need to run more tests." Nerve damage. The words barely sank in before the door opened again, and my mother rushed in. She looked like she had been crying for hours. She grabbed my hand, squeezing it tight, but I could barely return the pressure. I wanted to tell her I was fine, but I wasn't. And deep down, I already knew. I wasn't going to be fine again. The tests confirmed it. Whatever Mark had given me had attacked my nervous system. The doctors explained it in careful, measured words. Irreversible damage. Severe motor impairment. Long-term care. I heard every word, but my mind refused to accept them. At first, I thought it would pass. That with enough therapy, enough time, I'd be back to normal. But the weeks dragged on, and nothing got better. I had to relearn how to do the simplest things. How to hold a spoon. How to sit up without help. My legs were useless. My speech was slow. My words slurred. The damage was permanent. Mark never came back to the hospital after that first night. My mother told me he disappeared, stopped answering calls. Eventually, we heard he left town. Probably scared. Probably knowing he'd ruined my life and didn't want to face it. I spent months in rehab, trying to gain back whatever function I could. But there were limits. I'd never walk again. I needed help to eat, to bathe, to do anything I once took for granted. The worst part wasn't the physical struggle. It was the way people looked at me now. Like I was someone to be pitied. Like I was fragile, broken. People who used to treat me as an equal now spoke in softer voices, careful words, as if I might shatter if they said the wrong thing. And maybe I already had. Time passed. I learned to live with the new reality. The wheelchair, the therapy sessions, the slow, exhausting struggle to keep what little movement I had left. My family did everything they could to support me, but I saw the strain, the worry in my mother's eyes, the exhaustion in my father's face. I hated feeling like a burden. People asked me all the time, why did I do it? Why did I trust Mark? And I never had a good answer. In that moment, it hadn't felt dangerous. It had felt like a small decision, a tiny leap of curiosity. One step over a line I never thought would ruin me. But it had. I spent so long being angry. At Mark, at myself, at the universe for letting one stupid choice destroy my future. But anger didn't change anything. It didn't bring my body back. It didn't undo what had happened. All I could do was tell my story. Because maybe someone, somewhere, would hear it and think twice before trusting the wrong person. Maybe, just maybe, it would stop this from happening to someone else. I've always loved parties where you could dance, chat about nothing, and have a couple of cocktails without worrying about anything serious. There was a small bar in our town where people gathered in the evenings, and it felt like one big friendly group. Everyone knew each other, or at least recognized familiar faces. It wasn't a wild club, just a cozy spot where you could unwind after a long day. One of my friends, Josh, was the life of the party. He had this way of making everyone laugh, always knew the latest gossip, and most importantly, he was incredibly generous. He'd buy drinks for people without expecting anything in return. If you stood next to him, you'd probably end up with a free cocktail, simply because he felt like ordering another round. No one questioned what he was handing out. He wasn't a bartender or anything, just a guy who liked to share. I never thought much about it. Josh wasn't some mysterious stranger. I'd known him for a while. He was harmless, goofy, loud, sometimes a little too eager to keep the night going, but never someone you'd suspect of anything shady. If anything, people liked him because he made things fun. When Josh offered a drink, you took it. It was just how things worked. That night, the bar was packed, the kind of crowd that made you push through bodies just to get to the counter. Music was loud, but not too loud to talk over. I got my usual drink and set it down for a second, while I went over to my friend to talk about something. Probably some nonsense about work or school. It wasn't even a long conversation, just a minute or two. When I came back, the drink was still there, untouched as far as I could tell. I picked it up and noticed something odd. The color seemed slightly off. Nothing extreme, just a little different, like maybe the bartender had mixed in a different syrup this time. I hesitated for half a second but then shrugged it off. Lighting in the bar could be weird, and I wasn't about to make a big deal out of nothing. I took a sip. It tasted normal. Maybe a bit sweeter than usual, but not in a bad way. I wasn't the type to be paranoid about these things. The bar was full of familiar faces, and nothing had ever happened before. A few minutes later, I started feeling strange. At first, it was just mild dizziness, the kind you get when you stand up too fast. I assumed I was just tired. I'd had a long day, barely eaten, and now I was drinking. It made sense. But then it got worse. My vision blurred at the edges, and my limbs felt heavy, like my body wasn't fully responding to my brain. I remember gripping the edge of the counter, trying to steady myself. Someone said something to me, but I couldn't make out the words. The music seemed far away, voices muffled. I tried to move, to turn and find a familiar face, but my legs gave out beneath me. That's where everything goes black. I don't remember hitting the floor. I don't remember who caught me or if anyone did. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in a hospital bed, fluorescent lights too bright above me, my mouth dry as sandpaper. A nurse was standing nearby, and the first thing she said was that I was lucky. The nurse told me I had been brought in unconscious, barely responsive. My heart rate had dropped dangerously low, and they had to run tests to figure out what was in my system. I was still groggy, my body sluggish, but my mind was racing. I had no idea how I got there, no memory of the bar beyond that moment when everything went dark. When the doctor came in, he told me that whatever I had ingested wasn't just alcohol. They had found traces of a substance designed to cause paralysis and memory loss. Something strong enough to make a person completely defenseless. The realization sent a wave of cold through me. Someone had drugged me. The hospital contacted the police immediately. An officer came to take my statement while I was still in bed, my hands shaking as I tried to piece together the night. The bar, my drink, the color being slightly off. My mind kept going back to Josh. He had been the one always handing out drinks, the one always making sure people had something in their glass. I hesitated before saying his name. It felt ridiculous. But who else could it have been? When I finally said it, when I told them that Josh might have been the one to give me that drink, the officer's expression barely changed, but I saw the way he glanced at his partner, like something clicked into place. They left to investigate, but when I tried to call Josh myself, his phone went straight to voicemail. I sent him a message, no response. Then I checked with a mutual friend, someone who saw him at the bar that night. That's when I got the news. Josh was gone. Not just avoiding calls, gone. He had packed up and left town. No warning, no explanation. The last time anyone saw him was right after I collapsed at the bar. One of our friends said he had looked shaken, muttering something about needing to leave before slipping out the back door. That was it. No one had seen him since. It felt like the air had been knocked out of me. I wanted to believe it was a coincidence. That maybe he had his own reasons for leaving. That maybe I was wrong. But I wasn't. The police tried to track him down, but it wasn't easy. There weren't any working cameras in the bar, and no one had physically seen him tamper with my drink. My toxicology report confirmed I had been drugged, but it didn't prove who did it. Without hard evidence, it was just suspicion. Meanwhile, I was dealing with my own recovery. The effects of the drug didn't wear off immediately. I had trouble walking for days, my balance completely off. It took weeks before I stopped feeling like my body wasn't fully my own. Nights were the worst. I kept replaying the night in my head, imagining what could have happened if someone hadn't noticed me in time, if I had ended up somewhere alone, unconscious, vulnerable. Friends checked in on me, but I could tell they were scared too. Not just for me, for themselves. Josh had been part of our group, someone we trusted. If he could do something like this, who else was capable? And if he had run, it meant he knew exactly what he had done. Time passed, but the fear didn't. The police never found him. They traced a few credit card transactions, but then he vanished completely. No social media activity, no calls, nothing. He had disappeared, leaving behind nothing but questions. When I was finally discharged from the hospital, I couldn't bring myself to go back to my apartment. Instead, I went to my parents' house. I needed to feel safe, even if that safety was an illusion. And yet, the guilt never left me. I kept thinking back to the moment I walked away from my drink, how I had ignored the small change in color, how easily I had trusted. It was stupid, I knew that, but it didn't stop me from feeling responsible. Josh is still out there, somewhere, maybe in another town, another bar, handing out drinks and laughing like nothing ever happened. Maybe he's done this before. Maybe he'll do it again. I don't know if they'll ever catch him. But I know one thing. I'll never leave my drink unattended again, and I'll never mistake someone's kindness for innocence. Ryan seemed like the kind of guy who genuinely liked helping people. If you were short on cash, he'd offer to lend you some. If you needed a ride, he'd go out of his way. If there was a minor argument in our group, he'd be the first to step in and smooth things over. He listened well, really well, nodding in the right places, remembering little details, making you feel like he understood. Because of that, people trusted him. They told him things they wouldn't tell anyone else. And for a while, we thought he was just a good friend. I met Ryan at our local gym, where we ran side by side on the treadmills almost every day. We started talking, first about workouts, then about life in general. He always had a way of making people feel at ease, like he wasn't just waiting for his turn to speak. Over time, more and more people in our friend group started opening up to him. Relationship problems, work issues, family drama, whatever it was, Ryan was there to listen. It got to a point where, if someone was going through something, they'd instinctively go to him first. Looking back, it's crazy how none of us questioned why he was so invested in our lives. We thought he was just one of those people who genuinely cared. What we didn't realize was that he wasn't collecting stories to help. He was collecting them for leverage. At first, the weirdness was subtle. One of our friends, Mark, found out his email had been hacked. A few of his personal messages were leaked online, nothing career-ending, but embarrassing enough. He freaked out, trying to figure out how it happened. Ryan was the first to console him, saying it was probably some random hacker or a data breach from a site he had signed up for. He even helped Mark set up stronger passwords and two-factor authentication. Then it happened to someone else. This time, it was Sarah. She started getting weird texts from unknown numbers, referencing things she had only shared in private conversations. Soon, scammers were using her name, phone number, and even her address in fraudulent transactions. Again, Ryan was there to help. He explained how phone numbers could get leaked through data breaches and suggested she change her number. 1 or 2 incidents? Bad luck. But then it kept happening. Another friend's private photos ended up in the wrong hands. Someone else was blackmailed with a secret they had told only a few people. It was like, all of a sudden, every weakness, every vulnerability in our group was being exposed one by one. Ryan always had an explanation. He was quick to shift blame to hackers, bad security practices, or just pure misfortune. And at first, we all believed him. He was calm, rational, and never seemed overly concerned. But as the months passed and more of us became targets, I started to get a bad feeling. The coincidences were piling up. One night, after hearing about yet another incident, this time, a friend who had a sensitive work email leaked. I found myself replaying past conversations in my head. Ryan had always been present, always aware of what was happening. He never seemed surprised when things went wrong. And when people got desperate for solutions, he was the first one they turned to. I had no proof, nothing concrete to go on, but I couldn't shake the suspicion. Ryan was involved in all of it. One night, after a long night out, I ended up crashing at Ryan's place. It wasn't unusual. Our group had stayed over at each other's places before. He handed me a spare blanket, and while he went to take a shower, I sat down at his desk to charge my phone. His laptop was open, and without thinking, I moved the mouse. The screen lit up. I wasn't trying to snoop. But then I saw it, an open folder, neatly organized with names I recognized, names of our friends. I clicked on one. Inside were screenshots of private messages, emails, even call logs. Another folder contained photos, some harmless, but others clearly meant for blackmail. Some of them were taken from angles that suggested they were from hacked cameras or screenshotted from private conversations. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just collecting gossip. Ryan had been actively keeping records of everything. Every weakness, every secret, every mistake. I didn't even hear him come back until he was right behind me. "You weren't supposed to see that," he said, completely calm. He didn't rush to close the screen or make excuses. He just stood there, arms crossed. I turned to face him. "What the hell is this?" He sighed, shaking his head. "Nothing personal. Just business." I wanted to yell at him, to punch him, to do something, but I was frozen. My brain was still trying to catch up with the fact that the guy we trusted, the guy who helped us, was the one screwing us over. "You should close that now," he said, stepping closer. "For your own sake." I grabbed my phone and bolted. I barely remember running down the stairs and out into the street. My hands were shaking as I tried to process what I had just seen. Ryan had been playing all of us, using our trust against us. The next morning, I tried warning the others. Some believed me immediately. Others, especially the ones who still thought Ryan was their friend, weren't convinced. They thought I had misunderstood something or was overreacting. But then the real damage started showing. Ryan had been selling some of this information online. People started getting blackmailed, receiving messages threatening to leak personal details unless they paid up. Some of them weren't even from Ryan himself. He had put their information out there for others to exploit. One of our friends, Mike, had private emails about his family's legal issues exposed. He had to take time off work because of the stress. Another, Lisa, found out her old personal messages had been manipulated into something worse and used against her in an anonymous smear campaign. The worst part? We still didn't even know how much information Ryan had or who else he had shared it with. When we finally agreed to go to the police, Ryan was already gone. His apartment was empty, cleaned out. No laptop, no hard drives, nothing. It was like he had planned for this moment. He knew he'd get caught eventually, and he was ready. Some of us tried to track him down, but there was no trace. His phone was disconnected. His social media wiped. The guy who spent years inserting himself into our lives had disappeared overnight. We never got real justice. Some of the leaked information was removed, but the damage was done. Relationships were ruined. Trust was broken. Some people had to move, change numbers, start over. As for me, I learned my lesson. I don't trust easily anymore. I don't overshare. And when someone seems a little too eager to help, a little too invested in people's problems, I take a step back. Because now I know. Sometimes the people who act like they're there for you are the ones watching, waiting, collecting everything they need to destroy you. I met Alex when we worked together at an electronics store, helping customers choose gadgets. He was quiet, a bit withdrawn, but I always tried to get him to open up. I'd invite him to company get-togethers, make small talk during breaks. Eventually, he started warming up, and we hung out outside of work, grabbing coffee, talking about computers and video games. He never shared much about his personal life, but I figured he was just an introvert who needed time. I never thought there was something off about him. At work, he was dependable, though he rarely socialized. Customers liked him because he was patient and knowledgeable, and managers never had a reason to complain. If he hadn't been so closed off, he would have fit in just fine with the rest of us. I assumed he just wasn't the type to bond with coworkers, so I didn't push. Still, over time, we settled into a friendship of sorts. He was the guy I could count on for a game night, someone who never canceled plans at the last minute. At some point, I noticed small things that, in hindsight, should have made me question our friendship. Alex never initiated hangouts, but he always agreed to them instantly, like he was waiting for the invitation. If I ever mentioned a new hobby or interest, he would pick it up almost immediately, even if it was something he had never talked about before. I thought it was just his way of being a good friend, trying to have more things in common. It seemed harmless. Then, things started feeling off. I first noticed it at the gym. I'd been going there for years, always at the same time after work. One day, I spotted Alex in the corner, awkwardly standing near the weight racks. I was surprised. He had never mentioned working out, and I was sure he wasn't into fitness. I waved, and he gave me a nod, but didn't come over. When I asked him about it later, he just said he was trying something new. That would have been fine, except he showed up again the next day, and the next. And he never really did much, just lingered, sometimes pretending to use a machine but mostly looking around. Then, a few weeks later, I saw him outside the barbershop I go to. I go there once a month, always on the same day, like clockwork. It's a small place, nothing special. But there he was, standing near the entrance, looking at his phone. He didn't acknowledge me at first, so I called out, joking, "Hey, you getting a trim too?" He hesitated before saying, "Yeah, thought I'd try this place." I felt uneasy but brushed it off. Maybe he had been meaning to switch barbers. Maybe it was another coincidence. But then, one night, I decided to go to the store to pick up some groceries. It was late, and the streets were mostly empty. As I walked toward the entrance, I noticed movement in the alleyway beside the building. A figure stepped out. Alex. "Hey," he said, like it was totally normal. "Need a ride?" I stopped. "What are you doing here?" "Just driving around," he said. "Saw you walking and figured I'd offer." My stomach clenched, but I forced a laugh. "What are the odds, huh?" He smiled, barely. "Yeah, small world." I hesitated, feeling a strange pressure in my chest. Something about the way he was just there, in that exact moment, unsettled me. But I didn't want to overthink it. He'd never done anything wrong. He was my friend. So I got in the car. As we drove, the uneasy feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. The streets were quiet, and the only sound in the car was the hum of the engine. I tried to make small talk, asking him how his night had been, but his answers were short, almost distracted. He kept glancing at me, then quickly looking back at the road. When we reached my building, I expected him to drop me off and leave, but he just sat there, engine idling. I hesitated, then said, "All right, man. Thanks for the ride. I'll see you at work." He didn't respond right away. His hands were gripping the steering wheel tightly. Then, finally, he muttered, "Yeah, see ya." I got out, shutting the door quickly, and hurried inside without looking back. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I thought about all the times I had run into him lately. The gym, the barbershop, now this. It wasn't normal. The next evening, I was in my apartment trying to relax when I happened to glance out my window. My stomach dropped. There was a car parked on the opposite side of the street. His car. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe he was just passing by. Maybe he was visiting someone nearby. But as the minutes ticked by, he didn't move. He just sat there. I turned off my lights, moving carefully so I wouldn't be visible from the window. I peeked out again. He was still there. I grabbed my phone, hands slightly shaking, and texted a friend. "I think Alex is outside my building. He's just sitting in his car." "Dude, WTF? Call the cops?" I hesitated. What would I even say? That my coworker had given me a ride home yesterday and now happened to be parked nearby? It sounded ridiculous. I waited. An hour passed, then 2. Eventually, at almost midnight, he drove off. I barely slept that night. The next few days, I tried to act normal at work, but I could feel his eyes on me. Every time I looked up, he was watching. Not in a friendly way. His stare was blank, unreadable. I told myself I was imagining things, but deep down, I knew I wasn't. Then, one evening, as I walked home, I felt it again. The weight of someone watching. I turned a corner, and for a split second, caught a glimpse of him behind me before he ducked into a side street. That was it. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just coincidence. He was following me. That night, I made the call. I explained everything to the police. The weird run-ins, the way he always seemed to be where I was, the car outside my building. I expected them to brush it off, but they took it seriously. They told me to document everything, to keep track of when and where I saw him. They also suggested an app that could track my movements and alert me if someone's phone was consistently near mine. I installed it immediately. Over the next week, the results were chilling. Everywhere I went, work, the grocery store, even random errands, his phone was there too. He wasn't just bumping into me by chance. He was following me methodically, always staying just out of sight. Then, one afternoon, the police called. They had checked his background. Nothing major, no arrests, no history of violence. But when they brought him in for questioning, they found something disturbing. On his phone, he had detailed notes about my schedule, what time I left for work, which routes I took, when I was alone. And there was more. Drafts of messages he had never sent, some harmless, some not. Some hinted at frustration, at anger. Others read like half-formed plans. One of them simply said, "I just need to find the right moment." That was enough. The police didn't have enough to charge him with anything serious, but they warned him to stay away from me. And for a while, he did. But I never stopped looking over my shoulder. Even now, I catch myself checking parked cars, scanning crowds, feeling the weight of invisible eyes. I don't know what he wanted. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't noticed soon enough. What I do know is this. I thought I knew him. I didn't. And I'll never make that mistake again. Sarah was always active. She did yoga, drove an old station wagon, and loved the bakery near her house where she bought fresh bread. But for the past 6 months, she had been struggling with back pain. Some days, it got so bad she had to skip work or miss her doctor's appointments. The doctor told her she needed physical therapy and prescribed medication, but the cost was too high for her. She kept putting it off, hoping it would get better on its own. That's when Mark stepped in. He was more of a casual friend, someone she knew through mutual connections. He told her he could get the same pills for a much lower price. She was hesitant at first, but Mark assured her they were just as good, maybe even from the same supplier. Why waste money on the pharmacy when you can get the exact same thing cheaper, he had said. She was exhausted from the constant pain, and the thought of a cheaper solution was tempting. So, she agreed. When she brought the pills home, something about them seemed off. The packaging was messy, almost like they had been handled too much. There were no labels, no instructions, just a small plastic bag with some crushed powder at the bottom. It didn't look anything like what you'd get from a real pharmacy. I told her it seemed sketchy, but she just laughed. "Mark's got a good source," she said. "He wouldn't rip me off." She was convinced they were fine. I didn't push too hard. Maybe she was right. Maybe it really was just a cheaper alternative. For the first few days, she seemed better. The pain eased up, and she was back to her usual self. She even went to yoga again, excited that she could move without discomfort. "This is amazing," she said, grinning. "I don't know why I didn't do this sooner." At that point, I started thinking maybe we were overreacting. The pills seemed to work. She was happier, more active, and wasn't constantly wincing from pain. If they were dangerous, surely she would have noticed by now. So, I stopped questioning it. A few weeks passed, and then things took a turn. At first, it was little things. Sarah started losing her balance more often, brushing it off as clumsiness. Then she began slurring her words, especially when she was tired. "I think the pills make me a little loopy," she joked one night when she tripped over nothing in the kitchen. I laughed it off too, but something felt wrong. Then it got worse. She started dropping things: her phone, her keys, even a hot cup of tea that burned her hand. She'd stare at them on the floor, confused, like she hadn't even realized she'd let go. One day, she tried to text me and sent a bunch of gibberish. "Stupid fingers aren't working," she said. But by then, I wasn't laughing anymore. I told her she needed to see a doctor, but she resisted. "It's nothing," she kept saying, "just stress." But soon, she could barely hold a conversation. Her speech was slow, her movements shaky. One morning, she collapsed trying to get out of bed. That was it. I didn't ask anymore. I just took her to the hospital. The doctors ran tests, and when they came back, their faces were serious. They asked where she got the pills. I told them the truth. That's when they explained. Those weren't normal painkillers. They were laced with toxic substances that were attacking her nervous system. The damage was already severe. Sarah sat there, silent. I could tell she was trying to process what they were saying, but it was clear she didn't fully understand. When she tried to stand, her legs barely responded. That's when she started crying. I found Mark the next day and confronted him. He looked surprised, almost annoyed. "I just got them from a guy," he said, shrugging. "I didn't know they were bad." He acted like it was no big deal, like Sarah losing control of her own body was just an accident. He didn't even apologize. The doctors did everything they could, but the damage was permanent. Sarah lost most of her motor control. She couldn't walk without help, and even then, it was difficult. Her hands shook constantly, and her speech never fully recovered. She had to quit her job. She couldn't drive. Everything she loved doing, yoga, baking, even just living independently, was gone. Her parents were devastated. They filed a police report, but by the time authorities started looking for Mark, he was gone. Moved to another city. No trace of him. No justice. Sarah fell into depression. She barely spoke to anyone. A few of us took turns visiting her, trying to keep her spirits up, but it was hard. Most of our mutual friends had distanced themselves, not because they didn't care, but because they didn't know what to say. What could they say? The worst part was knowing this could have been avoided if she had just ignored Mark's offer. If I had pushed harder when I saw the pills look suspicious. If any of us had stopped and thought about what she was really taking. But none of us did. And now, this was her life. Sarah's world became hospital visits, physical therapy, and the slim hope that maybe, somehow, things would improve. But the doctors weren't optimistic. The damage was done. She would never be the same. I tell this story to anyone who will listen, because saving a little money isn't worth your life. Jack was always the kind of guy who lived for adrenaline, extreme sports, underground fights, anything that gave him a rush. I was his friend, but I tried to keep my distance from anything that felt outright reckless. We met during morning runs at the park, and back then, he just seemed like an energetic, active guy. Over time, though, he got into these semi-legal fights, where people tested their strength against each other while betting serious money. He invited me a few times to watch, but I usually turned him down. It felt like it could go wrong in too many ways. One night, though, he convinced me to come to a garage where his friends held their tournaments. The moment I stepped inside, I knew I'd made a mistake. The place smelled like sweat and motor oil, and a thick crowd of guys stood in a loose circle, the air buzzing with their shouts and laughter. No referees, no rules, just raw fights with cash riding on the outcomes. Jack and his friend, a guy they called Red, stepped into the makeshift ring, and the crowd started yelling, hyping them up. At first, it looked like a normal sparring match, both of them dodging, feinting, trading controlled punches. Jack had always been fast, and he moved like he'd done this 100 times before. Red landed a solid hit to Jack's ribs, and for a second, Jack stumbled back, grinning. Then something shifted. He wasn't just playing anymore. His hits got heavier, sharper, more relentless. Red tried to defend himself, but Jack was on him, hitting faster and harder. Then he threw a brutal punch straight to Red's jaw. Red's head snapped back, and he went down, hitting the concrete hard. But Jack didn't stop. He stepped over him and kept swinging, fists slamming into Red's face and ribs like he didn't hear the guy groaning beneath him. The crowd hesitated, torn between excitement and unease. Someone shouted for Jack to stop, but nobody moved to pull him off. I felt my stomach twist. Then Jack landed a final sickening punch, and Red went completely still. I shouted for someone to stop him, but the crowd was too hyped up, too caught in the violence to care. Jack sat on Red's chest, his fists still coming down, his breathing ragged. The sound of bone against skin was sharp, wet. My stomach twisted. It wasn't until Red stopped making any sound at all that people realized something was seriously wrong. His head lolled to the side, eyes unfocused. Blood pooled beneath him, spreading into the cracks of the concrete floor. The cheers died down. A few guys stepped forward hesitantly, finally dragging Jack off. I crouched next to Red, my hands hovering uselessly over him. He wasn't moving. His chest barely rose. "Call an ambulance," I said, my voice shaking. No one moved. I looked up. "Call the fucking ambulance!" Finally, someone fumbled for their phone. Jack stood off to the side, chest heaving, knuckles split open and dripping blood. He wasn't saying anything, wasn't looking at anyone. His face was blank, except for the way his fingers twitched at his sides, like he was still feeling the fight. Minutes dragged by. The sirens in the distance felt like they were coming too slow. Red didn't wake up. I kept staring at his chest, watching for the shallow rise and fall of his breathing. Jack hadn't even tried to check on him. When the paramedics finally arrived, they moved quickly, their faces grim. One of them checked for a pulse while the other started shouting medical terms I didn't understand. I caught only pieces: severe head trauma, unconscious, unstable. They loaded Red onto a stretcher and wheeled him out. I followed, but one of the paramedics stopped me at the door. "You coming with?" I turned, looking for Jack, but he was still standing where he had been, breathing hard, hands flexing at his sides. He didn't even look at me. "No," I muttered. No. I didn't know what else to say. The cops showed up not long after the ambulance left. Someone must have called them, or maybe the paramedics reported it. Either way, the garage emptied out fast. Guys who had been cheering minutes ago suddenly wanted no part in this. Jack was gone before the cops even stepped inside. I stayed. Maybe I was in shock. Maybe I thought running would make me look guilty. The officers asked questions, and I answered the best I could, but my head felt foggy. I kept thinking about Red lying there, the way his body had gone limp under Jack's fists. They asked where Jack was. I didn't know. One of the guys who stuck around muttered something about him leaving as soon as the ambulance took off. No one else claimed to know anything. Later, I found out Jack had skipped town. No one saw him. No one heard from him. He just vanished. Maybe he knew the cops would come for him. Maybe he didn't even care. Red was in critical condition. The doctors weren't sure if he'd wake up. When the cops called me in again, they kept pressing me for details. How often these fights happened, who ran them, what I knew about Jack. I told them the truth. I didn't know much. I wasn't part of it. I was just there that one time. That didn't stop them from looking at me like I was involved. Weeks passed. Red never woke up. His family didn't make any statements, didn't talk to the cops beyond what was necessary. Maybe they were hoping to keep things quiet. Maybe they just wanted it to go away. Jack was still gone. His number was disconnected. His apartment was empty. Some people said he was hiding out in another state. Others thought he left the country. No one knew for sure. The guys from the garage stopped talking about it. No one wanted to admit they were part of something that led to a man nearly dying. Some of them probably deleted messages, wiped videos off their phones. No one wanted to be involved. I tried to forget, but I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Red on the ground, saw the way Jack didn't stop, the way no one stopped him. Jack never reached out, never explained himself, never even seemed sorry. Maybe he didn't think he did anything wrong. Maybe he just didn't care. And maybe, deep down, that scared me more than anything. Owen was the most easygoing guy in our group, always smiling, always the first to offer a ride in his old sedan, always ready to help out. He was the kind of guy who'd show up uninvited just to lend a hand, and no one ever minded. We spent most weekends at his family's cabin, sitting around the fire, playing guitar, and just escaping the routine. He never complained, never asked for much, just enjoyed being around people. That night, we decided to check out a new country club outside the city. A few of us drove separately, planning to meet there. Owen brought along Tom, a guy I never really trusted, but I had no solid reason to dislike him. Just a feeling. Tom was quiet, kind of intense, the type who'd disappear in the middle of a party and come back an hour later without saying where he'd been. But Owen liked him, so we all let it slide. The party itself was nothing special. Loud music, overpriced drinks, the usual crowd. Owen, as always, was in a good mood, laughing, talking to everyone, making sure no one was left out. We didn't stay too late, just long enough to feel like we hadn't wasted the trip. Around 1 a.m., people started heading out. I was already packed with passengers, so Owen said he'd ride back with Tom. "See you tomorrow," he said, slapping my shoulder as he walked off. I watched as they got into Tom's car, the taillights disappearing down the road. It was just another night. No reason to think anything of it. The next morning I tried calling Owen. We were supposed to go to the supermarket for grill supplies, our usual post-party routine. He didn't pick up. Not weird at first. Maybe he was sleeping in. A couple of hours passed. I called again. Nothing. By afternoon, I started asking around. No one had heard from him. His car wasn't at his place. His phone went straight to voicemail. That's when I reached out to Tom. "Hey, where'd you drop Owen off?" Tom took longer than normal to answer. "Near some cafe. He wanted to grab something to eat." "Which cafe?" "I don't know, man. I was in a hurry. He just got out, said he'd text later." Something felt off. Tom was being vague, dodging the details. Owen wasn't the type to go silent for this long, especially without telling anyone where he was. I kept calling, kept checking, but by the end of the day, he was still completely unreachable. A week passed, and there was still no sign of Owen. His phone was off, his car was nowhere to be found, and no one had heard a word from him. I started driving around to all the places he usually went, our favorite bars, the gas stations he always stopped at, the cabin. Nothing. Tom had stopped answering my messages. When I finally caught up with him in person, he barely reacted. Just shrugged and said he didn't know anything. "I told you, man. I dropped him off, and that was it." He didn't ask if Owen had turned up. Didn't seem worried. Just kept shifting on his feet like he wanted the conversation to end. Owen's parents finally went to the police. A missing person report was filed. They tried to stay hopeful, but I could see the way his mom's hands trembled when she held her phone, waiting for a call that never came. The cops didn't have much to go on. An adult man disappearing after a night out wasn't exactly a high-priority case. But something was wrong. I knew it. Tom avoided me after that. Every time I saw him, he'd duck away, pretend not to notice me. He wasn't acting normal, and I started to think maybe he knew more than he was letting on. But without proof, there was nothing I could do. Then, a month later, Owen's car was found. It was an old fisherman who stumbled across it. Deep in a wooded area outside the city, near a river where people sometimes went camping. The car was half hidden in the brush, like someone had tried to keep it out of sight. The police got there fast, and soon the worst was confirmed. The car belonged to Owen. And inside, they found enough to know something terrible had happened. They didn't release details right away, but word spread quickly. Blood, signs of a struggle. No body, but enough evidence to assume the worst. And then, just as suddenly, Tom disappeared. He stopped going to work, deleted his social media. When the police went to his apartment, they found it empty. No furniture, no belongings, like he had never lived there at all. Now, everyone was sure. Whatever had happened that night, Tom was involved, and now he was running. But without him, we had no answers. Weeks turned into months. The police searched the woods, the river, anywhere they thought they might find something. But Owen was gone. Completely. His parents held out hope at first, but after a while, even they stopped pretending. The grief weighed on everyone. We stopped talking about it, but it never really went away. And Tom? He was never found. No sightings, no traces. Like he had vanished into thin air. Some people thought he left the country. Others believed he was still out there somewhere, hiding, waiting for the world to forget. I never did. Eventually, I moved away. I couldn't stand driving past the places we used to go. Couldn't handle the memories. Some nights, I still hear Owen's voice in my head, laughing, asking if I want to grab a drink, making plans like he's still here. But he's not. And I don't think we'll ever know what really happened that night.